One homeless veteran, one arrogant billionaire, and a private jet. No one saw this coming. The afternoon sun spilled its golden light across the sprawling private airfield, turning the polished bodies of the jets into gleaming silver sculptures. Engines rumbled in the distance as one aircraft soared upward, cutting through the warm sky with the kind of effortless grace that could make anyone stop and stare. Behind the tall steel gates, a lone figure stood still, his eyes tracking the ascent with quiet reverence. David Carter was no stranger to the sky. Once, the sound of a jet engine was as familiar to him as the beating of his own heart. Now, however, he was simply another man on the margins, middle-aged, with greying hair at his temples, a rugged beard lining his jaw, and clothes that spoke of countless nights spent without a home. His shirt was faded, his jacket threadbare, and his shoes bore the scuffs of a long journey on foot. Yet there was something in his bearing that resisted pity. His back was straight, his gaze steady. Even in worn clothes, David carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had once known both discipline and purpose. He leaned slightly on the fence, the sun catching the lines of fatigue etched into his face, but his expression was far from bitter. There was nostalgia in his eyes, a kind of longing that no passerby could have missed. Each plane that roared down the runway seemed to stir something deep within him, memories of cockpits, missions, and skies that had once belonged to him. To anyone else, he was just a homeless man watching planes. But inside, he was reliving a chapter of his life most people would never believe. Across the tarmac, a group of men in tailored suits moved with casual arrogance. Their laughter carried faintly on the warm breeze. Among them was Mr. Harrison, a billionaire whose fortune was matched only by his taste for flaunting it. His sharp navy suit fit perfectly against his lean frame, his shoes shone as brightly as the chrome of the jets he owned, and dark sunglasses shielded his eyes from the glare of the sun. He walked with the swagger of a man who knew the world bent to his will. It was Harrison who noticed David first. He paused, adjusting his cufflinks, his gaze locking on the lone figure standing by the gate. To him, the sight was almost amusing, this ragged man daring to watch something he could never touch. Harrison's lips curved into a smirk, the kind that was less about humor and more about superiority. "What's a man like that doing here?" he muttered to one of his companions, though he kept his eyes fixed on David. "Admiring jets he'll never even set foot in." His tone dripped with condescension, and the men around him chuckled, shaking their heads as if they shared in some private joke. David, unaware that he had become the subject of their ridicule, kept his eyes on the sky. His breathing slowed as another plane thundered past, the force of its takeoff vibrating through the ground and up into his chest. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though listening, not just to the sound, but to the memory it carried. The contrast was striking. On one side of the fence, luxury gleamed in the sun, embodied in the sleek jets and the men who owned them. On the other stood David, weathered and weary, but with a spark of something unshakable still alive in him. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind born from inequality, arrogance, and the cruel curiosity of the powerful. Harrison's smirk deepened as he adjusted his sunglasses, watching the man in worn clothes who refused to look broken. He didn't yet know who David was, nor what he carried inside him. All he saw was a chance for mockery, a moment to reinforce the divide between wealth and poverty. But if Harrison had looked closer, if he had truly seen the way David's eyes followed the jets with practiced familiarity, he might have thought twice before underestimating him. For beneath the ragged jacket and worn shoes was a story that could turn mockery into regret and silence the laughter of even the wealthiest men. Mr. Harrison's polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he crossed the distance to the gates. The billionaire walked with the air of someone used to owning the ground beneath his feet, every step deliberate, confident, and laced with entitlement. David Carter, still leaning against the chain-link fence, didn't notice him at first. His eyes remained fixed on the sky, following the distant hum of an aircraft disappearing into the clouds. Then came the voice, sharp, dripping with mockery. "Do you even know what you're looking at?" Harrison said, his sunglasses reflecting the worn figure before him. "These machines cost more than your entire life." The words landed like stones, not only on David, but on the small crowd that had begun to form. A pair of young pilots paused on their way to the hangar, their uniforms crisp, their laughter cutting through the warm afternoon air. Several assistants lingered nearby, clipboards in hand, pretending to work but clearly watching. The staff exchanged knowing glances, and soon chuckles rippled through the group. They smirked, delighted at the spectacle of wealth taunting poverty. David's jaw tightened. He turned his head slowly toward Harrison, meeting his gaze without flinching. His clothes might have been worn, his shoes scuffed, but his eyes, steady and sharp, were anything but defeated. For a moment the billionaire saw something in them that unsettled him. But the feeling passed quickly, swallowed by arrogance. Harrison's smirk widened. "Tell you what," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If you can fly one of these jets, I'll give you the plane." Laughter burst from the crowd. One assistant slapped another on the shoulder, grinning as though this were the best joke of the day. Even the pilots couldn't hold back, shaking their heads at the absurdity. A homeless man flying a multi-million-dollar aircraft. The very idea was laughable. David felt the heat rise in his chest, a mixture of humiliation and anger. He stood still, though, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lash out. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, nails pressing into his palms. Behind the quiet in his expression, his mind raced. They didn't know. They couldn't know. Years ago, he had been Captain David Carter of the United States Air Force. He had trained in simulators until his eyes burned, logged thousands of flight hours, and led missions where a single wrong move could mean death. He had known the roar of engines not as a dream from the other side of a fence, but from the seat of command. He had been decorated, saluted, and honored for his service, and now here he was, reduced to a target of cheap laughter, standing in clothes that told none of that story. His throat tightened. Should he tell them? Should he reveal the truth and watch their smirks fall away, their laughter die in their throats? Or should he simply turn and walk away, preserving his secret and his pride? David's silence stretched. The afternoon sun beat down on him, hot and relentless, while the eyes of the crowd pressed in like a weight. Harrison tilted his head, mistaking the pause for fear. "Thought so," the billionaire sneered. "All talk, no action. That's what separates men like me from—" "Well, men like you," the laughter resumed, sharper now, edged with cruelty. Inside, David fought to keep his composure. Every insult clawed at the walls of restraint he had built over the years. He remembered the sound of a co-pilot's voice in his ear, the adrenaline of takeoff, the weightless silence above the clouds. He remembered the medals folded into a small box he no longer carried, the salute of younger men who had once looked up to him. But all of that belonged to another life, one this billionaire couldn't possibly imagine. David's lips pressed into a thin line. He gave no answer, but the fire in his eyes betrayed him. Somewhere deep inside, a decision was beginning to form, though he wasn't ready to let it show. The crowd leaned in, eager to see how far Harrison's humiliation would go. The air crackled with tension, the kind that left even the bystanders holding their breath. And David Carter, veteran pilot turned homeless man, stood caught between the weight of his past and the sting of his present, uncertain whether to reveal the truth or let the billionaire's arrogance remain unchallenged. The laughter of the crowd had not yet faded when Harrison lifted his hand and gestured grandly toward the line of gleaming aircraft behind him. His sunglasses caught the afternoon sun, the smirk on his face sharper than ever. "Well then," Harrison said, his voice rising over the murmurs of his entourage, "there's my jet. If you think you're more than what you look like, prove it." Every eye turned to David. The billionaire's private jet stood gleaming like a monument to wealth and ego, its polished body reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. David felt the weight of humiliation press heavily on his shoulders, but even heavier was the silence of his own pride. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, he took a step forward. The laughter around him faltered. Just slightly. David's clothes were shabby, his shoes worn, but his eyes, steady and sharp, were unshaken. Each step toward the aircraft was deliberate, measured, as if he were walking not into mockery, but into memory. Behind him, Harrison chuckled. "Oh, this will be rich." He waved his hand toward his crew lounging nearby. "Go on, let him in. Let's all enjoy the show." The crew exchanged glances, unsure. But Harrison's word was law, and so with reluctant shrugs they moved aside. One young pilot muttered something under his breath, earning another round of snickers from the staff. As David reached the foot of the stairs leading into the jet, Harrison called after him, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't break anything, old man." David paused on the first step. He turned his head just enough for his words to carry back, spoken quietly but with a calm authority that silenced the whispers closest to him. "I know what I'm doing." Something in his tone, steady, confident without bravado, made a few of the staff blink. Harrison only laughed louder, brushing it off. Inside the cockpit, the air was cool and heavy with the faint smell of leather and machine oil. The hum of dormant electronics vibrated through the panels, alive yet waiting. David lowered himself into the pilot's seat with a familiarity that felt almost sacred. His hands, rough and worn, brushed over the controls like a pianist, reacquainting himself with the keys of an old instrument. Memories surged. The vibration of engines beneath him, the bark of orders through his headset, the cold clarity of combat skies where every decision was life or death. He remembered the adrenaline of takeoff, the stillness above the clouds, and the weight of responsibility that came with every mission. For the first time in years, the cockpit didn't feel foreign. It felt like home. Outside, the crowd had grown. Pilots, assistants, and curious staff gathered near the fence, their whispers buzzing with expectation. This is going to be embarrassing. He won't even know where to start. Just wait until he presses the wrong switch. Mr. Harrison stood in front of them all, arms crossed over his immaculate suit, his grin never leaving his face. The arrogance in his stance was absolute. He was certain he was watching a man march into his own disgrace. Through the thick glass of the cockpit, David could see their blurred shapes, see Harrison's confident posture. The sound of their muffled laughter reached him, faint but sharp enough to cut. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply, and let it pass over him. His hands moved with quiet precision, testing the controls, feeling the weight of muscle memory return to him like an old friend. Each switch, each lever, each button had a place in his mind, imprinted there through years of training and endless repetition. The hum of the electronics deepened as he brought systems to life, the cockpit awakening under his touch. Outside, the murmurs shifted. The laughter grew quieter, replaced by hesitant whispers. Wait. Does he actually know what he's doing? No way. It's just luck. Harrison scoffed loudly, determined not to let doubt creep into the show he had staged. Relax, he said to his entourage. He's playing pretend. Any second now he'll give up. But David didn't give up. He sat straighter, his shoulders squaring, his gaze fixed on the instruments as though the rest of the world didn't exist. For him, the moment was no longer about humiliation or arrogance. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that had been buried under years of hardship. Each breath steadied him. Each switch clicked under his touch with certainty. The smell of leather, the vibrations of power building beneath him, the weight of the yoke in his hand. It was all as it had once been. And while the crowd waited for him to falter, David Carter prepared to remind them and himself exactly who he truly was. The cockpit hummed around David, its panels alive with light and sound. He inhaled deeply, steadying his breath, his rough hands resting on the controls as though they had never left. For a moment, The world outside, the mocking stares, the arrogant billionaire, the weight of humiliation, disappeared. It was only him, the machine, and the sky waiting beyond the runway. Then, with practiced precision, David pushed forward. The jet's engines roared to life, a thunderous growl that rattled the tarmac and sent a shiver through the crowd outside. Heads jerked up. Conversations faltered. The laughter that had filled the air minutes earlier dissolved into stunned silence. Inside, David's heartbeat aligned with the vibration beneath his seat. He could feel every pulse of power surging through the fuselage, every note of the turbine's song calling back memories of missions where failure was never an option. His lips pressed into a thin line as his eyes scanned the instruments, unwavering. Outside, Harrison's smirk wavered. He adjusted his sunglasses, forcing a chuckle. "Relax, he's just pressing buttons. He won't even move it an inch." But then the aircraft shuddered forward. Smoothly, confidently, it began to taxi across the gleaming runway. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Assistants, pilots, and staff leaned forward as though drawn by an invisible string, their earlier jeers replaced with wide-eyed disbelief. The hum of the engines reverberated in their chests, drowning out their doubts. David's grip was firm, steady. Each adjustment of the throttle, each flick of a switch was executed with an ease that no pretender could mimic. His eyes flickered briefly toward the glass, catching sight of their tiny figures shrinking as the jet rolled away. He could almost taste their silence. The runway stretched long and endless before him, shimmering under the afternoon sun. Heat waves danced across the tarmac, blurring the horizon into a mirage of gold and blue. He centered himself, shoulders squared, breath calm. This was it. He eased the throttle forward, and the engines erupted into a full, deafening roar. The jet surged, pressing him back into the seat. The vibrations intensified, rattling through his bones, a living reminder of every takeoff he had once commanded. The nose tilted upward ever so slightly, the momentum building like a rising storm. Outside, no one spoke. The billionaire, Harrison, stood rigid now, his jaw tightening. His sunglasses slipped slightly down his nose, but he didn't push them back up. His smirk was gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. The jet sped faster, the world outside blurring. The runway markers flew past in streaks, the air thick with the scent of fuel and burning rubber. David's breathing slowed, controlled, as though he were syncing himself with the rhythm of the engines. And then he pulled. The nose lifted, smooth and deliberate. The wheels left the ground with a graceful defiance, and the aircraft rose into the sky. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold still. The crowd gaped upward, mouths open, eyes wide. The roar of the engines shook their chests as the jet ascended, cutting through the air like a blade of silver. Staff who had snickered earlier now stood frozen, unable to reconcile the homeless man they had mocked with the pilot, who now soared above them. Inside, David's chest expanded with something deeper than triumph. The weight of years, of hardship, of invisibility, of ridicule, lifted with the aircraft. He breathed in the sky as though it belonged to him again. His hands moved with instinctive grace, guiding the machine as it climbed higher, steady and sure. Below, Harrison's hands tightened around his sunglasses, the plastic bending slightly under the pressure. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. He watched in stunned silence, the image of his jet, his pride, his possession, flying flawlessly under the command of the man he had tried to humiliate. The sky stretched open, endless and blue. The sunlight poured through the cockpit windows, painting David's worn face with gold. His eyes were focused, calm, yet in them burned a quiet fire that no one on the ground could ever extinguish. The jet soared higher, the roar of its engines echoing across the private airfield. What had begun as a cruel spectacle had transformed into something else entirely, a revelation. And as the crowd below craned their necks upward, Harrison among them, Not a single voice dared to laugh. The jet cut a perfect arc across the sky, glinting in the sunlight like a bird reborn. David guided it with the steady hands of a man who had done this countless times before, his focus unbroken. Below, the crowd trailed the aircraft with their eyes, necks craned, every breath held in awe. For a moment it seemed impossible that the man they had ridiculed only minutes earlier was now the master of the sky above them. David angled the plane into a slow, controlled descent. The engines softened their roar, shifting to a steady hum that vibrated through the air. His fingers moved effortlessly over the switches, adjusting throttle and flaps, every action as fluid as muscle memory. The cockpit filled with the subtle whine of hydraulics and the faint scent of warm electronics. The runway stretched ahead like an old friend waiting to welcome him back. Outside, the silence was deafening. Not a laugh, not a jeer, only the faint rustle of wind against expensive suits and the soft whimper of a flag tugged by the breeze. Even the arrogant billionaire, Mr. Harrison, stood stiff and mute, his sunglasses now clutched in one trembling hand. The smirk that once curved his lips was gone, replaced by a thin line of disbelief. The aircraft descended, smooth and steady. With the gentlest of touches, the wheels kissed the tarmac. Not a jolt, not a wobble, just the whisper of rubber meeting ground. The jet rolled forward in a controlled glide, slowing with elegant precision until it came to a complete stop. Perfectly aligned with the runway markers, it was a landing most trained pilots could only envy. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by scattered murmurs. The staff who had mocked him earlier exchanged wide-eyed glances, their faces pale. One young assistant clutched the arm of a colleague and whispered, almost reverently, "He's no ordinary man, he's a real pilot." The words rippled through the group like a stone cast into still water, breaking whatever illusions they had clung to. Inside the cockpit, David sat for a moment longer. His chest rose and fell with slow breaths, the calm after the storm. His eyes drifted across the controls one last time, and memories of a life once lived, air bases, missions, camaraderie, medals that meant little outside the battlefield, flashed briefly in his mind. Then, with quiet resolve, he powered everything down. The hum faded into silence. The door swung open. David stepped out, the sun catching on his weathered features. His clothes were still the same, worn, patched, a reflection of hardship. But the way he carried himself erased any notion of pity. His back was straight, his stride measured, his gaze steady. He was not boastful. He did not need to be. Every step spoke louder than any victory cheer. The crowd parted as he approached, their eyes fixed on him. Not one dared laugh now. Even those who had scoffed the loudest lowered their gaze, unable to meet the quiet strength in his eyes. Mr. Harrison, however, remained rooted to the spot. His face had turned a deep shade of red, his jaw clenching and unclenching as though searching for words that refused to come. His chest rose with shallow breaths, every ounce of arrogance drained by the sight of his own plane, conquered by the man he thought beneath him. David paused near him. Their eyes met. For a fleeting second, Harrison's mask cracked. Behind it lay something raw and unfamiliar. Shame. He fumbled with his sunglasses, as if hiding behind them could shield him from the truth, now plain to everyone. David didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes alone carried the weight of his dignity, the quiet fire of a man who had endured more than most could imagine. In their depths was neither arrogance nor spite, only the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. Around them, murmurs continued. Respect had shifted, like the wind changing direction. Those who once dismissed him now looked at him with a mixture of awe and guilt. The imbalance of power had flipped silently, decisively, and without David ever raising his voice. He turned slightly, scanning the crowd one last time. Their faces reflected disbelief, reverence, even regret. The silence that followed was not born of condescension anymore, but of recognition. Then David walked forward, calm and unhurried, leaving behind the jet, the billionaire, and the whispers that would follow long after. His footsteps against the pavement were steady, echoing with quiet triumph. And though he said nothing, the truth lingered in the air. Undeniable and unshakable, the homeless man was never ordinary. He was a pilot, always had been, always would be. The murmurs among the crowd swelled, no longer laced with derision but heavy with curiosity and respect. They had witnessed a spectacle that overturned everything they thought they knew about the man in worn clothes who had walked by their polished airfield gates. One of the younger staff members, unable to contain himself, finally voiced what everyone else was whispering. "Who is he?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Another voice, older, trembling with awe, answered, "He's not just some wanderer. Did you see that landing? That was military." The words ignited a spark of recognition among a few of the pilots. They exchanged glances, and one nodded solemnly. "I've seen that kind of precision before. Only Air Force men land like that." Slowly, the truth unraveled. A few tugged at their phones, scrolling through old articles, records, anything that might confirm the suspicion building in their minds. And then someone gasped, holding out a screen to the others. On it was a faded image of a younger man in uniform, standing proudly beside a fighter jet, medals gleaming on his chest. The face, though younger and less weathered, was unmistakably David Carter's. Gasps rippled through the group like a wave. "An Air Force veteran. Decorated," one whispered. "How did we not know?" The weight of their ignorance settled over the crowd like a heavy fog. The same people who had sneered now stood hushed, their eyes lowered with shame. Harrison, still rooted where he stood, felt his throat tighten. His arrogance, so sharp, so cutting minutes ago, was crumbling. He looked at David, standing there with calm dignity, and felt something he hadn't in years. Small. His wealth, his status, his possessions, none of it could shield him from the truth staring back at him. He cleared his throat, the sound strained and awkward. "Mr. Carter," his voice cracked. He had mocked this man, stripped him of dignity in front of his peers, and now every eye was waiting for his response. I was wrong." The words dragged out of him, unfamiliar and heavy. "I treated you with disrespect, and for that I apologize." His voice faltered, but the silence that followed gave weight to his words. For once, Harrison's tone carried no mockery, no smugness, only the clumsy sincerity of a man humbled. David studied him quietly. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable, but behind his eyes flickered a lifetime of memories, of service, of honor, of sacrifices that had long gone unseen. He could have demanded the plane, he could have basked in triumph, but instead he shook his head slowly, his voice calm yet resonant. "Respect," David said, his words carrying across the tarmac with the strength of truth, "is worth more than riches. Don't judge a man by what you see." The crowd stirred, their shame deepening. Harrison dropped his gaze, his chest tight with the sting of the lesson. For a man used to controlling every room he entered, it was a rare and bitter pill to swallow. But David did not linger on his humiliation. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers, and for the first time they did not see a homeless man in ragged clothes. They saw the veteran who had once defended the skies, the pilot who had flown with precision and courage, the man of honor who asked for nothing but dignity. A quiet respect settled over the group. Some straightened their posture, others bowed their heads. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as cruel entertainment had become a moment of revelation. David's steps were slow and steady as he began to walk away. He did not hurry, nor did he shrink from their stares. Each stride carried the quiet assurance of a man who knew his worth, even if the world had forgotten. Behind him, whispers rose, not of ridicule this time, but of admiration. "He's a hero. How did we not see it?" "We'll never forget this." Harrison remained silent, his face pale, his pride shattered. But in his chest, buried under layers of arrogance, something shifted. He would never look at the man the same way again. None of them would, as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the airfield. The lesson lingered in the air like the echo of the jet's engines. True worth isn't measured by wealth or appearance, but by experience, dignity, and character. And David Carter, a man once dismissed as nothing, had reminded them all of what it meant to fly, not just above the ground, but above prejudice, arrogance, and ignorance.